All right, thank you for joining us. My name is Matthew Bay. I'm a senior analyst here at RANE, and joining me today is Chase Blazik, an analyst from our Asia Pacific team. And we're here to talk about kind of what U.S. President Biden has been doing in terms of his economic outreach to Asia to try to counter China, all of those things. Chase, we just had the U.S. Signing the agreement for the IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, another one of those lovely acronyms that we have for FTAs, or sorry, trade agreements, not an FTA, in Asia Pacific. So Chase,
Right.
What do you think Biden's trying to accomplish right now, and why?
Well, I've been keeping track of your writing pretty closely, Matthew, and I think you're spot on that he's trying to do the best he can with the cards he has for Indo-Pacific trade and for sort of counterbalancing China's economic influence there. But as you mentioned, with the Trade Promotion Authority expiring, and it doesn't seem like he's putting this up for renewal anytime soon, the ability for the president to pass free trade agreements is quite limited. So, sort of doing what you can shy of a free trade agreement while trying to keep these countries engaged. But that was actually the first question I had for you. Is this ill-fated, trying to keep countries engaged while there's not much promise of more access to the U.S. market?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of these countries are going to, through the IPEF framework, IPEF, they're going to basically be trying to pick and choose what works for them. So what's interesting about it, and it probably shows that there's actually not a ton of momentum behind the IPEF as a block, is that countries can pick or choose which ones to actually go into. They don't have to go into all the pillars that make it up, and there's 4 different pillars. There's like one on climate change, one on trade, things like that. So you might have, for example, India be willing to talk about digital trade just because it is a major market for overseas workforce that are doing things online. So that might be something that they could be engaged in. But given India and not really targeting net zero climate change net zero energy transition by until I think 2070, they won't probably make any concessions on climate change. They're one of the slowest countries that are to address that. So that actually means that some of them will pick and choose where they can get some benefit out of it. But in terms of a block, there's going to be a lot of challenges from the Biden administration to use it in that way. It's trying to look at some of the aspects of TPP, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which became the comprehensive CPP TPP. I know all these acronyms, right? They tried to are taking some of the elements of that FTA, which was an FTA that had market access, and trying to look at the non-tariff aspects of it when they're looking at IPEF. Now,
So
most of the countries want market access.
that was one question I had for you: is if many of these countries have already negotiated a lot of these things with the CPTPP, it shouldn't be a big deal for them to agree to some of these things in IPEF. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. But if you think about negotiations often have concessions on both sides. The inclusion of those issues in CPTPP or TPP was largely because of the idea that I was going to be or if I was a Southeastern Asian country, I was going to have an FTA with the United States, the biggest
Right.
economy in the world, an actual economic powerhouse that can rival China, all of these things. So it was willing to actually some of these countries were willing to make concessions on issues like environmental standards or labor protections, because there was they were going to get that market access. If they don't get that market access, you know what, they may not have the same willingness to make those concessions. A great example of that, and it kind of came back to hurt them, was Japan. I know Japan's not a developing country by any stretch of imagination, but then Prime Minister Abe, he did a huge push against the country's agricultural sector and the
Which
protectionism
is a
there,
big deal
and
in
he
Japan.
dismantled it, and he spent a ton of political capital, but he dismantled it because he knew it was one of the number one or number two demands that the U.S. had in TPP talks, to actually seal them. So Japan, made those concessions on the idea of, well, I'm going to get an FTA with the United States. That kind of blew up in their face. So even from Japan's perspective, it's like, well, they kind of got burned last time. While they, for strategic reasons, will still want to join probably all the pillars, they're not going to be making the same kinds of concessions that they probably previously had done.
Right. I wanted to ask a little bit of a more tactical question about these pillars. I know you said there's four different pillars. The countries can sort of say, I'm interested in pillars 1 and 3, but don't talk to me about 2 and 4. Right. But even within some of these pillars, it seems like the Biden administration, or perhaps all of these countries, I don't know who exactly crafted which terms, but even within some of the pillars, there's contentious elements. Like the digital trade pillar also includes labor and environmental issues. So, will they be able to say, "I want pillar one, but only these elements of it," or will it be this battle of you have to negotiate issues within pillars?
So, I mean, I think it's probably going to be all or none because that's just the way that negotiations are in general when it comes to these things. The trade pillar, yes, it includes environmental standards to a degree, includes digital trade, it includes labor
Labor,
protections, yeah, things like that. Yeah, if you're going to be engaging in that pillar, they're going to be trying to get some sort of an agreement in place. And it's really hard to have then, 5 or 6 agreements to cover that at once. So I would assume it would be an all or none thing. But right now, the countries are all debating and discussing, which one they want to do or which ones they want to participate in. They're supposed to have that basically wrapped up. Like they said originally within a 2-week timeline. I haven't seen anything coming out in terms of statements on which countries will be adopting
yeah,
what.
me neither.
But then, it's going to be 2 years, or at least planned to be 2 years of intense negotiations, which actually in FTA talks and in trade talks, 2 years is actually a very short timeline. TPP was negotiated for basically a decade.
Is the market access part of that what takes the longest time? And if there's no market access on the table, will this be easier? Is 12 to 18 months reasonable?
Market access is a big part of it, but also some of the things that are becoming more common and more standard in the more advanced TPP, like the TPP negotiations and trade talks like that, is things around like, for example, if a domestic country's society or industry has specific industry groups that are doing regulations, or there is a comment period for a new regulation that's being done by the government. Does that mean that exporters from country, are the ones that export them, do they have the same level of being able to complain or make comments as domestic companies? A lot of those things are becoming are challenging. Or, for example, if you're talking about some kind of a certification process, will the regulators in the other country then have access to then look at the certification process in the other country? So there's a lot of these like sovereignty issues that are really difficult to kind of negotiate as well, that are really just technical issues. And quite often, it's not as if the countries are trying to um, make concessions or not in these areas. It's just that it's a lot of details and a lot of very technical work that's going into it.
So would you characterize the timeline as ambitious or a flat out a pipe dream?
I mean, it's very ambitious. He wants to do it, within 2 years. It doesn't, and I guess you can, if you scale back the ambition of the agreement itself, you can probably hit that timeline. But then do you actually have a very good agreement? That's the thing. It's a trade off between the two.
What about the lowest hanging fruit? I know you mentioned supply chains, right? Everyone cares about supply chains. We can all talk about those. Though it is something all of these countries are interested in, what are some of the difficulties that may arise in discussions about supply chains? And is there like a lowest common denominator that they could all agree on that's maybe likely to be to reach an agreement? If not in 12 to 18 months, then just eventually.
Yeah, I think that the supply chain issue, like around semiconductors, which is a very internationalized industry, there might be something there. But even then, what can they realistically do? I guess in around the semiconductor industry, just because it's so rigid, you have very long lead times. Once you put in the order, you're going to get it,
Right.
20, 30 weeks down the road. I don't see a lot of room for that. And then if you look at on things like energy, many of the countries besides the United States aren't really, energy exporters. India and Japan, for example, are major energy importers. Australia and the U.S. are major exporters, of course. So I think there's an issue there. On agricultural markets, we've seen in Southeast Asia, and in India, hardcore nationalism around the exports of things like palm oil or wheat. So I'm not really sure if there's a ton of room for actual agreements that are functionally, when put into practice, alleviate the actual crisis. If that makes any sense. I think they'll come up with a on paper agreement,
Something.
but yeah. But there's still going to be challenges when it comes to if they want to do like joint procurement, all that kind of stuff. That is a challenge in today's modern society.
So, what about the membership? So I know it was the US, some Western countries, and then like ASEAN, basically. And then a couple days later, it was Fiji as well. Do you think this could bloat into, most of the Asia Pacific? I know that sort of there are some drawbacks to that, right? If it's already going to have a long negotiations time and you start adding everyone and their mom, that makes it worse. But what do you think about the membership
I mean,
question?
I think at this point they'll stick with the countries they have. A few more might join, but they probably will want to get something on the table. And then there will be a few countries that kind of join that. For example, TPP in the TPP talks. I don't think Canada and Mexico, I believe, joined in 2012, which is like 7 years into the process. If I remember correctly, it's been a while. But
That was a long negotiation.
yeah, my point though is that we will probably have other countries that are considering it, and some may join it, but as you say, you add more countries in, it gets much more complicated.
What about Taiwan joining?
No, the U.S. has been very explicit that Taiwan will not, or at least initially, isn't going to join, even though it wanted to. As you can probably speak to a lot better than I can, doing so would provoke significant backlash by China.
Yeah, and I bet it was strategic by the US. They know that many of these other countries don't want to, they're not willing to poke China just to include Taiwan in a trade framework that they're not necessarily highly hopeful about. So I bet it was mostly strategic, saying, we'll do this other thing. And that's the other part is this 21st century initiative with Taiwan, which is basically IPEF, but just with the US and Taiwan. And they're negotiating that right now. I've heard some folks say that that could be sort of a gateway into IPEF if they can get stuff going with Taiwan and then they get IPEF going and then they have similar goals. So they can eventually say, hey, why not add Taiwan? But I think that kicks the can down the road. The issues of not wanting all these other countries not wanting to unnecessarily anger China, that won't go away in 12 to 18 months or 24 to 48.
Yeah, and once you have an agreement in place, the question will be is like, okay, if Taiwan wants to join and the U.S. wants Taiwan to join, what's the mechanism for joining? Will the other countries have a veto power over that, or will it be, or would they need to have a majority of them, something like that? Because I mean, in some cases it might only take a couple of countries to block that. My question to you is, how do you think that China will react to IPEF when it comes to its own regional, I guess, trade strategy? I mean, they've got RCEP already, and they keep on floating the possibility and apply to join TP or CPTPP. What do you think China's going to be doing on this?
Yeah, I think they're pushing to double down on RCEP as far as implementation and the developments going on in the region with that. CPTPP, they're pushing for that, but that's the same issue with Taiwan joining IPEF, right? There are a number of countries in CPTPP that have real beef with China right now, and like Australia, for example, and Japan, who have recent very bad baggage with China, and they have, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, they have veto power. If China wants to join, they could say, no, we don't want you to join. And it's the same thing with Taiwan. Taiwan is almost a non-starter with joining CPTPP because of the same issue. Most of these countries are not willing to rackle China just to get Taiwan in. Though Taiwan is a moderately sized economy, it's just too much trouble.
And for our viewers, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that is another free trade agreement that is basically bare bones, that came into force a few months ago, that China is in, and a lot of Southeastern Asian countries are in as well. CPTPP is the successor to TPP. That's a free trade agreement as well, but it was kind of U.S. designed and has a lot more standards on top of just the free trade. Yeah, and an IPEF is kind of trying to take some of those standards and apply them to the negotiation without having the FTA. I guess the last thing that I kind of had for you, Chase, is do you think there would actually be room down the road for China to actually enter CPTPP? I know they've put it out there. They would have to do a lot of changes in terms of the regulatory standards to align it with CPTPP. But do you think that is how realistic are they actually going for this? I guess.
Well, I mean, they really want it in Beijing, first of all. They don't want to be excluded from the region, and they want to be able to influence any sort of trade negotiations going on in the region, rather than what they viewed this as originally as the US trying to keep China out of the Asia Pacific, which they view as their own backyard. So China wants in, but I think it really depends on sort of this very heated strategic moment we have right now. I think that would have to pass. And Japan and Australia and other countries, there are issues with very particular parts, like China not being willing to reform SOEs and other issues that are part of CPTPP. Those are real sticking points too. So if the strategic moment right now of competition sort of passes and everyone says, China's not that bad in 5 years, then there's still the issues of these technical aspects of CPTPP that some current members are quite doubtful that China would be willing to implement. So it's not a walk in the park. It's not impossible because, like the U.S., China's got a big market, and that goes a long way in trade agreements. But I wouldn't put a lot of hope on it in the next 5 years.
I mean, I guess you could make the argument that in many ways TPP would have served its purpose if it actually forces China to make some of those concessions and actually get
Right.
into this successor.
Right.
It's a really roundabout way for it to have some success, but I guess that would be one way. But going kind of to the question about will they actually implement those reforms? How do you think Xi, other power players within the Communist Party are looking at that? Is there a divide there that we can look at in terms of maybe there's one cohort that is more in favor of those kinds of reforms? I assume Xi is not, and then also I guess is that going to be something that's a key theme as Xi is likely to be getting a third term later this year?
Yeah, I mean, this has been something that the Chinese state, the governing apparatus, has been pushing the last few years. Is we're reforming and opening, and she keeps saying the same thing. Xi Jinping, we're reforming and opening, so we're opening more and more to the world. The outside world doesn't usually perceive it that way, but in some ways they have been. Or the financial sector has been opening up more and more, especially with things like insurance, allowing in Western companies, some to even not have a joint partnership, to just be wholly foreign owned, which is kind of a big deal for China. But in many other ways, the economy is not opening up. Like she has been very much pushing state-owned enterprises, making them stronger, making them leaders in key sectors. So saying, "Oh, we want to really scale them back just to get into CPTPP." I guess it would be depend on enforcement. Can China promise something that CPTPP won't be able to hold them to, just enough for them to get in? Maybe, but that's a big point of contention for at least Xi Jinping, and just one example of there are some real structural things that unless CPTPP has good enforcement, they're not going to get through to China.
The one way I could see them trying to kind of thread the needle, and I don't know if it will work, is kind of adopt the model that we've seen other countries do, where their SOEs are effectively independent entities. But to do so, China would be giving up control over them, which is the political control of them, which they probably wouldn't want to do. So I don't think you'll ever have that independent and actually independent SOEs in China, the same way that you might see in say in even a country like India.
Right, and that hasn't been the trend, right? Over the last few years, they've been strengthening the role that these SOEs are going to be playing in very at-risk sectors, trying to help them buoy the at-risk sectors and buoy the developing sectors like the big tech. So it would be quite against trend for China to say, okay, we're going to give up on some of these SOEs. Yes, they're still state-owned, but we're not going to have any say on them. That's against trend. I did want to change topic real quick and ask you a different question. We've talked about this a little bit with U.S. tariffs on China for the longest time. No, no, no. There's no there's no developments going. And in the last few weeks, few months, maybe Yellen has been Treasury Secretary Yellen, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, has been saying, we may use tariffs, and has more recently said the Biden administration is actively considering easing some China tariffs to help ease inflation. Of course, they would likely be non-national security related tariffs. But what do you think is the prospect for that, either for U.S.-China trade negotiations, which is probably much bleaker, or these very limited tariff easings?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more of the latter. I mean, you can make the argument that from a strategic point of view from the United States, the tariffs aren't having an impact. They're not changing China's strategy. China's been doubling down on a lot of these, industrial sectors and giving more subsidies. So who is really hurting? it's probably more the U.S. than China is right now, and China is still exporting a ton of goods to the U.S. So from that perspective, it would make a lot of sense for the U.S. To change the structure of the tariffs, even if it wants to keep them as leverage, where it removes some of the tariffs that are on um, intermediate goods that are crucial for U.S. manufacturing, or goods that are not very strategic that China isn't really propping up. Like, do we really need a 25% tariff on imported toys from China? Probably not. While then honing in or keeping tariffs that are specifically geared towards industries that China is supporting with subsidies, whether that be high technology or things like heavy industry like steel, aluminum, things like that. Now, challenges there, of course, is that the electronics industry, it's another major consumer one here in the U.S. So that is something where it is something that a lot of consumers probably would prefer not to have, a 25% tariff on, an imported electronics device or whatever. That is, some of them are
Let's say a drone.
Or a drone, yeah. So I think that is something that is possible, is to narrow it down that way, or expand the exclusions that they have. So, for example, the U.S. has now reinstated some of the exclusions that companies can request to be omitted from tariffs if they can't import the product from somewhere else. They might be able to do a little bit more around that. And there is a review of the List 1 and List 2 tariffs, which were the first ones implemented. Under the law, they basically have to review them 4 years after they're implemented. The first ones were done in 2018. Those first two lists are coming up to review over the next couple of months. And it's possible maybe the U.S. uses that as an opportunity to start making some of these things. But if we're talking about a new investigation, so a new Section 301 investigation, for example, against China's use of subsidies, that will take more months to actually go. Now, I'm only talking about it from a strategic point of view from the U.S.
Right,
and
right.
I've actually got a column coming out next week probably that is actually looking at, well, given the U.S. domestic political system and the fact that it's increasingly polarized, does that somehow tie the U.S.'s hands when it comes to making these strategic decisions on trade? It is doing that right now, for example, with IPEF. Why isn't the U.S. doing anything with IPEF in terms of trying to offer market access? Well, because domestically, you're not going to get an FTA through Congress, so that's why.
And conversely, there was a lot of congressional pressure to include Taiwan in IPEF, and that didn't
point.
go.
Yeah, and then when we look about this from the standpoint of tariffs on China, if you reduce tariffs on China, that is the perfect soundbite for Trump supporters and President Trump to be using ahead of midterms.
Not good for an election year.
Yeah, exactly. So there's all these kinds of political manifestations that are going to probably restrain how much Biden actually can do on this.
And then I guess one final question on that before we address a question from the audience here is, will this actually help with inflation? I've heard arguments saying both sides. I know the U.S. inflation problems are much bigger than just the tariffs on China, but what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think the studies that I've seen have said, like, if you were to remove them all, it's on the order of like 1 percentage point.
All U.S. tariffs on China?
Yeah, it's very, very small. We're not talking about a very.
And the U.S. would not remove all of them. They would remove a select few.
Yeah, and the other thing is that to me, the inflation argument isn't about of the need to remove tariffs, isn't so much about actually reducing inflation. That is kind of what they'll sell it as, but it's more about the administration, in my view at least, having to point and do something. A lot of times politicians have to do something about an issue, so they just do what they can do, and even if that what they can do isn't necessarily going to solve the issue, it's it's that trap that they're in sometimes when you're a political figure. You've got to do things in order to show to the voters that, hey, I am trying to address your concern, even if it doesn't have an actual impact.
Right,
so I
it
think
could be a
you look at the administration's options around inflation. There are no good ones.
Yeah.
And this is at least something that they can say, hey, look, I am actually trying to do something.
Yeah, maybe they're gambling. People care more about rising food prices than they care about China tariffs.
Yeah, and so we did have one question from our viewers, basically asking, can China be a regional leader despite never opening up? Can sheer money speak for itself?
I mean, that's been the question since the 70s and 80s for China. And China has opened up some. I mean, SOEs used to be industry in China. So from that perspective, and now the private sector in general rules, although you've got these large state-owned enterprises that are behemoths on the world stage and in their certain industries in China. So China has opened up some, but I mean, its market size has spoken for itself for a long time. I mean, this has gotten China by in many areas where it promises market access and says we will do X, Y, Z. And most countries are willing to say, okay, well, that's good by me. I'll keep track of your whatever XYZ you said you would do. We'll ask you again in 5 to 10 years, but for now, let's open up. So, I mean, that's at least the narrative that Washington is supposedly getting tired of now, is that we've taken China's promises for 20 years, and now we actually need to start holding them to some of them. So it's a fair question and a more nuanced background on it. I don't know. China's market speaks for a lot, especially in Asia, but in the West, increasingly, that market size is less potent.
So I would make the argument that regionally, it can be a regional power economically, militarily, and politically, just be given its sheer size and sheer amount
Right.
of market size and money. We've already seen that. I mean, you look at the level of trade, for example, between most of this ASEAN countries and China. It's bigger than the U.S.'s trade, so it's already big. So I think they definitely can. Now, what I would say is that when it comes to setting standards for international issues, whether it be trade related issues or technology specifications like 5G, et cetera, they will have to adopt international standards to do that if they want to become a leader in there. Another area for that, everybody talks about yuan internationalization. Well, the only way the yuan can actually compete with the dollar eventually, and I'm talking about a very long time, is if they remove their domestic capital controls. They're not doing that,
Right.
so it will never be like a competitor to the same degree. But in some areas, they have liberalized. For example, around telecommunication standards. Initially, a couple decades ago, in like the 2G and 3G wars, China tried to build their own standards to compete with the West, and then they were the only country that used it, and they found out they couldn't sell their technology abroad because it didn't meet the standards of the technology standards that were sold abroad. So what have they done now? They've actually started to have Chinese. They've started to have Chinese companies being the ones that are leading standards development around 5G, to try to influence the international ones so that they are playing a leading role in that. And China has their so-called standards 2035 strategy to do that in a bunch of different sectors. So in
Right.
many ways, it depends on where you're looking at. Are they going to lead, or are they not going to lead? Another way where I personally would look at is potentially them trying to do a similar thing, is having Chinese patents play a larger role internationally. I know that Chinese IP law has been long, or Chinese domestic IP things have been long criticized for stealing IP. It's a market you can't trust, etc.
Right.
But
Right.
what has China tried to do over the last 5 years? It's strengthened its internal IP laws, because it's now getting to the point where Chinese IP in certain industries like AI, gene editing, things like that, are starting to be as competitive to the West. So if China wants to actually play an influencing role globally, it needs to start developing that ecosystem domestically, whether it be having the lawyers necessary to actually enforce those kinds of IP things. So I do think
Right.
there
And
are areas where
that's been the
China is
critical
doing
view of
that.
the IP, is that China in the last 5 years has been protecting its domestic IP, especially to protect those technologies they're developing, and they care about the foreign IP, but just not as much.
Yeah, so I think in some areas we are seeing China liberalize around like standards and the way they're looking at that, as a way to play more of an international and regional role. But in other areas like finance or SOEs, things like that, there are limitations to how much they actually want to liberalize there or use the international
Right.
model. So I think it's just kind of pick or choose, which I know is a very different issue than RCEP, but it's a great topic no matter nonetheless.
Certainly.
Now, with that said, I want to thank you all for joining us. If you like our stuff, you want to go read more, you can always visit us at www.raneworldview.com or www.stratfor.com. We do have our Q3 forecast that we publish around quarterly. We have that coming out in a couple of weeks, so please read it. We're all working on it right now. It's got some great stuff on it. So Chase, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Matthew.